Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us. Our panelists are already lined up, so let's convene today's summit. And joining us today, Mr. Jason Brodsky, Policy Director of United Against Nuclear Iran, Dr. Ori Goldberg, Iran expert of the Lauder School of Government at the Reichman University, and Hananya Naftali, Israeli political commentator. Thank you all, gentlemen, very much for joining us today. And our main topic, the threat is still very much on this past hour. Israel raising the alert, the travel alert level, not just to Turkey, but also the UAE, Bahrain, Jordan, and Egypt, as it fears Iran is planning an attack, very determined attack against Israelis. So before we begin the debate, let's take a closer look on the cat-mouse game between Jerusalem and Tehran.
Istanbul would usually host thousands of Israeli holidaymakers this time of year, but now Israelis are deserting the largest city in Turkey. Over the last few weeks, Israeli intelligence claims to have thwarted several attacks from Iran on Israelis holidaying in Turkey, and the Israeli government is urging all citizens to return home as soon as possible, or if not, to lock themselves in their hotel room. Israeli media has reported that these prospective Iranian attacks were ordered by Hossein Tayyib, the head of intelligence for the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, in retaliation for Israel's continued penetration of Iran's intelligence systems and alleged assassinations of top Iranian officials. Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz has said that Israel will retaliate if its citizens are attacked in Turkey. But is this a good strategy for a country trying to normalize relations with its neighbors? Will an eye for an eye turn the Middle East blind? Are Israel and Iran just playing a never-ending cat-and-mouse game?
So let's get to it. Are Iran and Israel engaged in this never-ending cat-and-mouse game? Gentlemen, you know the rules. You each get 30 seconds to lay out your initial stance, and we pick up the debate right after. So, Mr. Brodsky, please take the lead.
It's great to be with you. Good evening. I think Iran and Israel are playing a never-ending cat and mouse game because of the true nature of the Iranian regime, which is revolutionary and terrorist. And so I think that we've seen these cycles before, and sadly, I think we are seeing it now, and they will continue into the future unless the Iranian leadership changes.
Well, we will talk about this unless later on. Dr. Goldberg, I have a hunch that you have a different outlook. The podium is yours.
Well, thank you, Ellie. You're absolutely right. I don't think this is a never-ending cat and mouse game. I think this is a game of ongoing, constant escalation. I think Israel is contributing more than its fair share to this escalation. We have to remember that even if these supposed attacks in Istanbul are actually happening, they are in response to Israeli acts carried out on Iranian soil.
Right. And last but definitely not least, Hananya, your take?
Thank you, Ali. Well, let me begin by saying that the end is near. The end of the Islamic Republic of Iran is very near, and they know it because they are oppressing their own people. They tell their people that Israel is their greatest enemy. And how does that make any sense? I mean, Israel is a country of 9 million people, while Iran has more than 80 people. So that does not make any sense. And I speak with Iranian people. They tell me that they know who their enemy is. It is not Israel. Their enemy, they tell me, is inside of Iran. It's Khamenei and the Ayatollahs that spend their money on terrorism across the Middle East instead of investing it in the Iranian people.
Well, fascinating, and we'll get to those points later on. And from this point onwards, gentlemen, please feel free to interact. I would like to begin with something that may sound a bit counterintuitive, but the bigger the success in foiling those terror threats, the bigger the chance something will follow through, as in the Iranian determination or desperation, as Israeli officials are dubbing it, is growing as well to carry out such attacks. And indeed, in the past hour alone, we're hearing renewed travel alert level as being on the rise to numerous other countries here in the region. So what's happening really, Mr. Brodsky?
Well, I think we're seeing the implementation of the octopus doctrine from the Israeli government, targeting the head, Iran proper, as opposed to solely its tentacles, its proxies and partners in the region. And the calculation is to get Iran to influence Iranian decision making so that the costs of undertaking operations abroad outweigh the benefits. And so that's the calculation right now. And it takes time to build deterrence, but that's what I sense Jerusalem is thinking at the moment.
But speaking of deterrence, bottom line, with all the Israeli might and intelligence, Israelis are sheltering in hotel rooms or canceling planned trips. Is this real deterrence or the epitome of successful terrorism, Dr. Goldberg?
Oh, I would argue that this can in no way be counted as successful deterrence. I mean, if this wonderful, how did Mr. Brodsky refer to it? It's the octopus doctrine. If going after the head of the octopus instead of the tentacles results in ordinary Israeli citizens being chased around Istanbul, assuming, again, that's actually happening, I would say that strategy has failed abysmally. I would also suggest that it's not a strategy, it's merely tactics. Israel does targeted killings, as we like to call them, assassinations, as they're called around the world, particularly well. It usually fails in strategizing. It usually fails in accounting for the results of its policy. And we can see the results of this policy right here. What the Iranians are doing, if they are actually doing this in Istanbul, again, marks the failure of the way Israel has gone about addressing this problem. It is worth mentioning one other point. When we talk about Iranians as though Iran was a monolith, I think we are misrepresenting the complexity of this situation. If this is truly about the head of intelligence for the Revolutionary Guard or for the Quds Force, then what I hear is that there are tremendous internal struggles inside the Iranian leadership. That means that this initiative was not approved, as far as I can understand, at the highest levels of government, but this is a way for a senior operative, but not the most senior operative, to leave his mark and to emerge triumphant from these internal debates. Israel is feeding the fire within Iran. It's not making
uniting the higher ranks of Iran.
That's exactly right. Israel is not making Iranian leaders pay for failed strategies. It is rallying Iranian leaders around the flag.
Interesting. And Hananya, you know what, let's zoom in on the Israeli strategy or tactic, as Dr. Goldberg is suggesting here. I will be careful in phrasing it, but this series of mysterious deaths of top Iranian officials, which Tehran blames at Israel largely, wasn't that something that's prompting to an extent an Iranian response?
Well, I have to say that it's very interesting that I think the Mossad has more friends in Iran than the regime. And, you know, I have to disagree. I think that Iran is very weak, the weakest it has ever been. You know, I visited Turkey just recently in March, and wherever I went with my Star of David necklace. I told everybody that I'm an Israeli, and everybody welcomed me with a warm hug. Now, obviously, we need to find balance between staying safe and living life to the fullest. But, you know, the media loves to portray it as Israelis are being hunted down, and as far as they like it.
Not the media, Hananya. The Israeli government is essentially begging Israelis to come back home. You know, it is worth mentioning this strategy on behalf of Jerusalem. Okay,
it's also
and Ellie, I have to agree.
Hananya has not answered your question.
I have to.
My mediation skills are poor, but we will not pinpoint anyone for not answering a question. It's a debate. So
okay.
yeah,
I have to say, Ellie, that at the end of the day, regime agents wanted to hunt down Israelis, but they found themselves being hunted down by the Turkish authorities with the assistance of Israelis. So obviously, it is dangerous. I will not take any amount from that, but they claim victory because they think that their people are dumb. But Iranian people are not dumb. They understand that Iran is the weakest it has ever been, and you know what? They are also hiding the fact that both Israelis, Arabs, and Iranian people are all united together against this evil Islamic regime. So you're telling me that it's Israel's fault? So this is just absurd. Iran is the problem, and Israel is the solution to this.
It's just worth noting that what you're saying has absolutely no connection to reality on the ground, either in Iran or in Turkey or generally in the Middle East. But other than that, that's a lovely answer. Of course, it's not an answer because you didn't address the question you were asked. Obviously, Israeli strategy here, or Israeli tactics, obviously Israeli assassinations carried out on Iranian soil are the point of origin for this entire escalation. But this is standard Israeli policy. Israel has been escalating and claiming it has done so in the service of de-escalation. That doesn't work. Escalation causes more escalation. Violence brings more violence. I'm not suggesting that Iran is not Israel's enemy. I am suggesting that Israel has played a major part, if not seriously, a foundational part in the situation we're seeing in Istanbul.
Mr. Brodsky, do you think...
It almost sounds like you're justifying the Islamic regime, so this is just
Does it
very
really?
interesting point.
Of course, it's not interesting at all because I did not justify anything the Islamic regime did. All I did was point out that it takes two to tango. And Israel has been tangoing very, very directly with Iran. Israel has been transgressing most of the rules I know for international conduct. Think about what the Israeli response would be if there was a series of mysterious deaths among senior Israeli operatives. Think about what Israel would see itself entitled to do. And then consider if the Iranian response wasn't. Oh, really? Why is this happening? It's happening because there are two parties here that are fighting each other. This is a war. It's a covert war. But the Israeli attempt, sort of like what you're trying to portray, as though this is just a general bond between Israelis, Arabs, and Iranians to get rid of the Islamic regime, I have to say, not only are you making life easy for yourself, but speaking effectively, when it comes to facts, what you're saying has absolutely no connection to reality.
Yeah.
Well, I've been speaking to Arabs, Iranians. Actually, before this interview, I spoke with my Iranian friends from Tehran, asking for their perspective, and friends in Dubai. So, reality is sometimes a slap.
That's a very persuasive argument.
It takes two to tango. Let's make it a three-way. Mr. Brodsky, you're too polite. So please chime in.
2 points I want to make. First is that I think a lot of what the problem is as the international community's response to the Iranian challenge generally. It has been treating Iran for far too long as just a nuclear file. There has not been the degree of urgency and attention given to these other issues that Israel is reacting to, for example, missile and drone proliferation and sponsorship of terrorism. So that's a very important factor, I think, that is influencing the Israeli calculation. And secondly, I'm skeptical that the Hossein Tayeb, the head of the IRGC's intelligence organization, is freelancing here. He is very close to Iran's supreme leader and the office of the supreme leader, and it is highly unlikely, in my view, that he is just undertaking this without any approval from the highest levels of the regime. So those are just 2 points I'd like to make.
Yeah, so it will not be the first time we'll see regimes playing good cop, bad cop. We're nearing the end of this part of the debate. So really briefly, and after the break, we will dive into Turkey a bit. Mr. Brodsky, you've mentioned the attempts to revive the nuclear deal. Again, without mentioning any non-nuclear activity, is that a mistake on behalf of the Western powers?
I think that the Western powers needs to change its approach. Returning to the 2015 version of the nuclear deal is a mistake because the clock has already started running. Some of the sunsets have already expired, for example, the arms embargo on Iran. And we should be using the leverage and building the leverage to try to get a more durable agreement for the United States and the international community.
Jason Brodsky, Dr. Ori Goldberg, and Hananya Naftali out for a third break. Much more when we come back. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Hananya Naftali, Dr. Ori Goldberg, and Jason Brodsky. Thank you, gentlemen, for staying with us. We're staying on topic, expanding our conversation a bit. But before we dive back into the debate, let's take a listen to what Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett had to say at the weekly cabinet meeting this morning on the current state of affairs in Istanbul.
These days, we are witnessing Iranian attempts to harm Israelis in various destinations abroad. The Israeli security establishment is working to thwart terrorist attacks before they take place. We will continue to harm terrorists and their senders. Our new rule is, whoever sends, pays. At the same time, we warn the citizens of Israel to refrain from flying to Turkey at this time if it is not necessary, with a special emphasis on Istanbul. The threats there are still high. I call on the citizens of Israel to take personal responsibility and maintain their security.
So let's kickstart another quick round of 30 seconds each. Today it's Istanbul and also the UAE, Bahrain, Egypt, Jordan adding to the list this very evening. Tomorrow it's Argentina, and in 2 days' time it's Lebanon. Is there a non-diplomatic solution to the Iranian-Israeli standoff? Mr. Brodsky, please.
Well, I think that we're going to see these travel warnings continue, and it's not just the killing of Israelis that the Iranians are looking for, but also the potential kidnapping of Israelis, and they're borrowing the playbook that they used with Iranian dissidents in the region. They've been kidnapped from Turkey, they've been kidnapped from Dubai, so this is going to be going on for some time until the Iranians feel that they've reestablished the deterrence equation.
Hananya Naftali, Israelis simply needs to get used to it?
Well, I have to say that, first of all, of course, there is a non-diplomatic solution, but we don't want to get there. But I have to say that the West, headed by the weak Biden administration and the global EU, they're being played by the Iranian regime, speaking about the nuclear deal, because the regime is acting like this problematic kid that demands candies in exchange for good behavior. And any parent who gives in to this kids' demands is buying time, not solving the problem. And I have to say that same thing with the Islamic regime. They deserve a stick, not a carrot. I mean, how can you negotiate with a regime that arrests journalists and beats women, hangs gays, and shoots its own people, instead of negotiating with this radical Islamic regime that looks down on its people? I believe that the West should negotiate with a leader who the people look up to, like Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, that loves the Iranian people and loved by them.
Dr. Goldberg, the floor is yours.
Thank you. There is no non-diplomatic solution to the situation. I agree with Mr. Brodsky, assuming that no side is going to make a gesture that strives for a resolution. This is going to continue for some time. As for what Hananya just said, again, I have to say, as far as my knowledge of Iran goes, absolutely no connection to reality, not the former crown prince, not leaders imposed by the outside. Anybody who knows Iranians just a little bit knows that if there's one thing that rallies Iranians around the flag, it's an attempt to superimpose a leadership on them.
Well, gentlemen, this is the part where you can freely interact, of course, and you've all mentioned the nuclear deal, so let's begin with that and then go back to Israeli diplomacy for a bit. The Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, the American one, is saying today that the nuclear deal is within reach, pending an Iranian decision. But this is happening as new documentation is being revealed on this underground network in the Natanz facility. The IAEA is still extremely skeptical about any prospects of transparency or full cooperation on behalf of Tehran. Is the West making a mistake here, giving in too much leeway to the Islamic Republic, Mr. Brodsky?
I think we've been diplomacy heavy for the past year with the Iranians, and there has not been enough coercive diplomacy with regard to the Islamic Republic. And the U.S. is not the only player here. Europe is a big part of the issue. Europe has not imposed any sanctions, as Iran has been violating the agreement with crossing once unthinkable red lines with 60% enrichment, the advances on uranium metal, and the Europeans haven't reacted beyond statements. So this has been a core part of the issue, in my opinion.
And let's try to look on the silver lining here, perhaps, or at least an opportunity. This line between Jerusalem and Ankara, a phone call between the Israeli President Isaac Herzog and Turkish President Erdogan, Israeli Foreign Minister.
If I may, Ellie, just in response to Mr. Brodsky's words, I disagree profoundly with his conclusions, and I'd like to point out that the initial violation of the JCPOA was committed by the United States, who withdrew unilaterally and imposed unilateral sanctions. What the European parties are doing at the moment is remaining within the framework of the agreement as it still stands. Presenting what the Europeans are doing as weakness and presenting what the Iranians are doing as unprovoked violation simply disregards the role of the United States and the Trump administration, and obviously Israel's advisory role in reaching this situation in the first place.
But you know what? Let's
Ellie,
stay on this topic. Yes, please.
I have to interrupt and debunk this misinformation delivered by Ori, because the JCPOA was actually the JCPOA was actually broken by the Islamic regime, that they continue to progress their nuclear program in secret, and actually the Mossad uncovered this thanks to former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So this is just
Hananya,
kind
what
of
you are
absurd.
saying is just a barefaced lie. Okay, this isn't misinformation or something
I'm
that's
speaking
open
facts.
to interpretation.
You don't have to like
you're
them.
not. No, you're not. You're lying. Every major intelligence
Expose me if I'm
organization in
lying.
the world.
Please do.
I'm telling you what the facts are. Every major intelligence organization in the world, including Mossad, stated and verified that Iran stood by each and every one of its commitments after the agreement was signed. What former Prime Minister Netanyahu presented to the world had to do with a nuclear archive that dates up to 2003, not 2015. What you're saying about Iran being the initial violator of the agreement is just a lie, not misinformation. It is a lie. I'm not saying the Iranians are righteous. I'm not saying the Iranians are not aggressive or hostile. I'm not saying that they haven't pursued other venues, since American violations and European passivity drove the Islamic Republic to this state of affairs. But what you are saying about Iran being the initial violator is simply a lie.
Hananya?
I disagree.
Yeah.
I disagree. I have to say
There's no
that
matter for disagreement.
it is true.
Lie.
Well,
It is true
Mr.
that
Yes,
the
yes.
Iranians continue to progress it, and there's obviously, why are they turning off up to 27 cameras of the IAEA? There's obviously they have a lot of things to hide. And
you just said something that was a lie. You said Iran was the initial violator of the JCPOA.
we're talking about the past nuclear agreement and also the current one that is being forged, and I strongly oppose it.
There is no past and present one. There's only one. It still exists. You said Iran was the first to violate the agreement.
There is no disagreement over the fact that Tehran currently is not adhering or cooperating.
It's doing this overtly. That wasn't what we were talking about.
Yeah. I'm just trying to get us out of the deadlock of these negotiations. We are nearing the end of this debate, unfortunately. Definitely not out of passion. Mr. Brodsky, before we conclude, the Turkey-Iran relationship here is fascinating. Frenemies of sort, right? Erdogan is better off with Jerusalem this time around as he tries to solidify his position as a regional superhouse.
Well, everyone would like to see a closer Erdogan deny the permissive environment to Iran's proxies and partners that Turkey unfortunately has provided for years. But there's a reality here, and Turkey shares a border with Iran, and there have been bilateral irritants in the relationship beyond the targeting of Iranian dissidents and Israelis. There are disputes over water. Turkish troops have been fired upon by Iran-backed militants cooperating with the PKK in Iraq. So there is a whole host of calculations that go into the relationship and the tensions that we're seeing today.
The ever-shifting pendulum of the Middle East, and luckily for us, for me, that's for sure. I had you gentlemen to try and clear the clutter, or at least add some questions into the equation. Dr. Ori Goldberg, Jason Brodsky, and Hananya Naftali, thank you very, very much for coming on the show. I really do hope we will see you again shortly. Thank you very much, gentlemen. We're out.